Okay, so we've had 3 sayings from the cross so far. And it's been 2 weeks since I asked you the question. So this is a real test. 3 sayings we've had so far. What was the first one?
Forgiveness.
Good. About forgiveness. Father, forgive them. Excellent. The second one? Anybody remember what the second one was?
We weren't there.
It was still in Luke. We weren't there. Well, it's in the Bible, David. Gee, we weren't there. I'm not No, it's still in Luke. The second one.
The guy on the cross.
Very good. Today you'll be with me in paradise. That Mary is 2 for 2.
I got the third one too.
The rest of and you got the third one too. You see this? The rest of you. She's doing her homework. The third one we moved out of Luke's gospel. We went over to John. And the third one. Mary's. I got it. I got this one. Okay, Mary. 3 for 3.
Here's your son.
Yeah.
Here's your
yeah.
mama.
Yeah, it's your mama. Yeah. So now we go to the fourth saying, and it's the only saying that actually is in 2 of the Gospels. All the other 6 are just found in 1, either Luke or John. This is the only one, the fourth saying, that's in Matthew and Mark. Luke and John were written afterwards and didn't include them, but I guess they figure, well, Matthew and Mark wrote it down, so we don't have to necessarily go there. Whatever, don't know, but it's the only one that's recorded in 2 Gospels. It's the fourth one. And I think probably it's the one that comes from perhaps the deepest part of Jesus' soul and really touches us in the deepest part of our soul. And for me personally, just express my personal kind of thought, there have been a lot of different things written and a lot of different views on this fourth saying. I'm not talking about in terms of teaching, as you'll see in a minute. I mean, like when we say, forgive them, and you get into a great big doctrine on forgiveness and atonement and sin and all that, okay, great. I'm not talking about a lot of different views doctrinally, but different views on what the heck is going on with this fourth one, as you'll see in a minute. We're going to go to Mark. We're going to take the reading from Mark instead of Matthew. If somebody wants to go to Mark chapter 15, just 3 verses, 33, 34, and 35. Mark 15, verses 33, 34, and 35. If you get it and want to read it, just go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Glory.
And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi,
You got it.
What, Lema Sebastiani? Which is, interpreted, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of them that stood by, when they heard it, said, behold, he calls Elijah.
So Mark and Matthew would both concur that there was a supernatural darkness that fell upon the earth, so to speak, during the time that it should be the brightest, from noon until 3 o'clock in Jerusalem. Is sun is at high noon, but instead it's pitch black kind of thing. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out, Eloi, Eloi, which is Aramaic, Lama sabachthani. And it says the people around the cross didn't get it, which makes it kind of funny to me that the one thing that becomes obvious nobody really got at the time, we still don't 2,000 years later in a lot of ways, which is this. There's basically 2 views that you could take of Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's only 2 views. Either God did forsake him and he's asking why, or God didn't forsake him and he's asking why. We know one way or the other, you can't get around the fact of what Jesus said. The question that's raised that I really think we do have to answer for ourselves is, did God forsake him or didn't he? Jesus very clearly, when I say they weren't getting it, Jesus very clearly is quoting the first verse from Psalm 22, which is a messianic psalm about the suffering Messiah, Psalm 22. Any good Jewish boy or girl would have known Psalm 22, the context of it. And that's the first line of the psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? David wrote it. It's the first line of that psalm. Now, Russ, would you go to Psalm 22? I want to drive home the point that there is no question that Jesus is not just throwing out a statement, my God, why have you forsaken me? That there's no question that Jesus is actually identifying with and quoting Psalm 22, verse 1. When you get to Psalm 22, would you read verse 8?
Commit yourself to the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, because he delights in him.
Which version is that?
New American Standard.
Okay. It's not as clear there as...
The yourself is not, that's in italics, it's not actually there, so it's without
Yeah.
Commit to the Lord, let him deliver him.
Yeah, it's not very clear there, but just because of the translation, that basically it's referring to people standing by and saying he trusted in the Lord, let the Lord deliver him, which is the same thing you'll find in Mark and Matthew,
Yeah.
that's what the people that are at the cross are saying. Would you read verse 16?
For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet.
Okay, so that's a little bit clearer. They pierced my hands and my feet. That is unmistakably what's happening at Calvary. Verse 18.
They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Okay, so again, you can read it. What Russ is just reading for us from Psalm 22. The reason why I'm having him read that is to show you that Psalm 22 is all over the place at Calvary. It's not just a matter of someone sitting and saying, well, I'm pretty sure he was quoting Psalm 22. It's all over the place. And the gospel writers, all four of them talk about dividing of the garments, and they're all referring to Psalm 22 like crazy. So Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? You'd be hard-pressed in any way, shape, or form to say he's not actually quoting Psalm 22. He's actually just crying out of his own spirit. I think we can clearly say he's quoting Psalm 22:1. I said there's two views. Either he's asking that question of an absentee father, so to speak. Dad, where are you? You've left me. You've forsaken me. Why? He's either asking the question, or he's asking the question much like Psalm 22. When you read Psalm 22 in its entirety, it becomes clear. We're not going to read the whole psalm. I'll refer to some bits, but it becomes very clear that God did not. It's what David writes, that God did not forsake him, which makes the question, why have you forsaken me? So, we're going to take it from the point of view, there's two thoughts, basically two schools of thought, if you would. One, that the Father did forsake him, and Jesus is asking why. And the reason that, Bible scholars and people give, there's one verse, actually half a verse, in the prophet Habakkuk. We should probably read it. Habakkuk, it's a very small book, the first chapter, the 13th verse, that first half of it. The reason people give, anybody who gets to Habakkuk, let me know. The reason people give, Jesus said, why have you forsaken me? Because God can't look upon sin, according to the prophet Habakkuk. He can't look at sin. And so therefore, when his son was made sin on the cross, he had to turn away and basically desert him, if you would. Habakkuk, the first chapter, verse 13. Actually, it's a long verse, so all we want is the first half. about God's eyes being pure.
My table of contents is missing Habakkuk.
You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look at wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously?
Well, that's okay. That's enough. So he's basically, Habakkuk is saying God cannot look on sin. He can't look at anything evil. He turns his head away. He can't look at it. That's the nature of what people have gotten out of what Habakkuk said. And Bible scholars, you can go and read them. The proponents who say that he forsook Jesus, they'll use that verse. Well, God's eyes are pure, and Jesus became sin on the cross, so he couldn't look at him. That's all there was to it. That's one of the reasons they give. He became sin and its punishment. The crucifixion, punishment for sin. We know what sin means. It means separation from God. So what's your problem, Steve? Okay, he became sin, so he was obviously, in becoming sin, was separated from his Father because he became sin. A representation of sin, whatever kind of words you want to use. As you go through Psalm 22, like I said, it becomes clear that God had not deserted, abandoned, forsaken David, the writer of Psalm 22, Jesus, who's the Messiah, who is representing, that the abandonment wasn't there. But in the middle of the psalm, it says, "You have answered me," which gives people the impression, okay, so he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" God had forsaken him. And then after he goes through a very horrendous psalm, he says, "You have answered me." So they say, well, he did separate himself and he did forsake him, but it was momentary. Then he returned. "You have answered me." The thing. So you came back. In other words, it was a brief, not permanent, separation. So my question for those, I wish I had somebody here of the mindset perhaps, to just ask them, so what was the criteria for God returning? I mean, if you're willing to say that he deserted him in his time of need, his greatest time of need he ever knew in his entire life, nothing had changed, no conditions had changed, so why did God return? That becomes interesting to me. You got to have criteria, especially those people who are trying to develop doctrines. You better come up with something doctrinally that can say, well, this is what happens. In your greatest hour of need, God will desert you.
Oh dear.
But if you cry out to him, he will come back. Sometimes it starts to get to the point of insanity. To be honest with you, it sounds like religious insanity to me. If you're a religious nut, a religious fruitcake who is intent on lining up all your ducks because you don't get it, then you come up with nutty stuff. The granola Christianity, fruits, nuts, and flakes kind of thing. You come up with that kind of granola Christianity. Instead of saying, if I looked out and noticed that your car was parked a foot from the curb, and I said to you, "Mary, you parked kind of far from the curb." You say, "No, I didn't." Say, "Yes, you did. I can see. You're a foot from the curb. You're practically out in the middle of the street. You parked way off the curb." "No, I didn't." "Mary, how could you possibly say that?" "Because I wasn't driving." "Oh, but it sure looks..." The car is still a foot from the curb. And I'm pretty convinced, I know that Mary was in the car. You say, "What are you trying to say?" See, the second view, I said, is that the Father did not forsake the Son. See, we attach, when he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" we make that a fact, that God had forsaken him, instead of saying, "He sure felt forsaken." And Dad is saying, "But I was there all the time." So the question becomes kind of an interesting one. Is it a legitimate question that he is forsaken or that he's feeling forsaken? And by the time you finish the psalm, David realizes, I felt like hell. I felt like I was in the depths of hell. I have never felt so awful.